afternoon, Meryl. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this cadre of characters. And I'm really pleased to be able to talk about food sovereignty as a major focus in my part in this whole process of all of the rest of you speakers. And instead of focusing on why we're in such a predicament, I'd like to offer as many solutions as possible at ground level. And even though this is not a long opportunity to do that, we can focus in on the fact that food sovereignty is all about creating an ecosystem in which people aren't outside of it, but step directly into a relationship with the soil, the nature of plants and animals, and try to bring as close into their physical realm, or realm of reach. And so today, some of my information, it may sound a little scattered at first, but I'm going to talk about soil systems, reading the landscape. There's a lot of ways that we can do that. Bees and all pollinators, in fact, the incredible importance of maintaining an insect system in our ecosystem as farmers and gardeners, and on a really large scale. And I'd also like to talk quite a bit about SRI, which is a basically system of rice intensification, which is a process. It's not a technology. And it's just one of many doorways that have opened in the last few decades where people can have a much better understanding of growing crops according to what the crop wants, what makes it comfortable, bringing forth, just like with everything in agriculture and food and nutrition, the highest potential. And in a lot of cases, the potential is about providing, shall we say, a buffet of circumstances that the farmer and the gardener can put together so that all the players, whether we value them directly or not, can participate to their highest possible good, or their structure, or their mission in life. And we as humans have our own ideas about what we think we're going to be doing, but most of the plants and animals and insects, they already got that figured out. They're hardwired. They go through life noticing and sensing their environment with great clarity. They don't make a lot of mistakes on where they're going to find their food, their comfort, their mate, or whatever. And as humans, we tend to overthink that a little bit. So why don't I start with soils, farms, and landscapes. In my consulting work for other farms, which is born out of my need to get answers for my own farm, and not having found good answers locally in the traditional channels, universities or extension agents, and probably the worst are like fertilizer and equipment dealers. They're not a good place to get accurate, unbiased information. And then, of course, gardeners and farmers are in this program. We're trying to help people become food sovereign, even if you've never grown a garden or participated in the farm system before. It's getting to be really critical that we do. In a lot of our neighborhoods, we have people farming within reach of households that don't even have a garden plot, but people can go and present their case and be members of, say, a CSA, community supported agriculture, or any variation of that, farmers markets or whatever. But the most important thing is to know who is growing your food, know what their practices are. If you think that their practices could be improved and you have the ways and means to provide a little assistance with that, maybe labor, cash course is wonderful, but at least get to know it and self-educate. It's we're still hovering around that condition in this country where less than 2% of the people who are eating, that's everybody, really is fully aware, even partly aware of where their food comes from. And a lot of people don't even know what the plant looks like. And this is like a huge disconnect that has sprung up ever since, say, I'm going to say it began in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and it went wildly out of control by the time World War II ended, where agriculture was separated from most of the social consciousness. And when that happened, corporations also took over our knowledge base about how food is grown, and we took a lot of things for granted. And we're in an age now where we can't take this for granted anymore, because we see how quickly it went off the road. So in this work, a lot of people are asking for answers. They're looking for answers. They've maybe tried a lot of avenues, like doing soil tests. We'll start with that. I have to remember that a soil test is just a piece of paper. Plants and animals don't read our books. They don't go to our schools. They don't have any concept of what people are all about. But if we make them comfortable on their terms, things work out pretty good. So a soil test, for example, is like a snapshot that the chemistry world has given us, a so-called tool. But it was designed to satisfy and please fertilizer and pesticide dealers and corporations. The soil test is useful, but very limited unless you add other pieces or other aspects to it. Now, if you really wanted to learn more about your land, and I will add this link here at some point, and it would be get to know all the species and the names of the plants in your landscape that you're intending to farm or are farming or gardening in. That means all the weeds in particular. Very, very important to know what character they are, because those are the real soil tests before we had labs. We had plants, we had animal behavior, and we could walk out in a field or a farm that was new to us and have a pretty good sense of what was right and what was not right. And it's not the case that we can always go to a landscape and just insert or superimpose our intentions or will on that landscape and have great results, because sometimes nature's rhythm or frequency for that piece of land is much different than our intention. And so the farmers and gardeners who, especially the farmers, enter a landscape with a little bit too much hubris, they get into trouble, and nature keeps on knocking them down with one problem after another because we're not listening. It's much easier to listen when you're a gardener. You're not in the tractor, you're not in the truck, you're on your feet. You're down close to the ground. You can taste things, smell things, see things. If you have kids in your life, they can be even sharper eyes than ours, because they notice stuff that adults sometimes don't. This is part of the ecosystem where the family and the farmer become a part of their landscape every day. In fact, and it's often been said to me by mentors a lot older than I am, that the farmer's footsteps are the best fertilizer for the field. And I took that to heart a long time ago and found it to be very true. If you go out into a field, for example, and you want to grow vegetables for your family, you may see the field simply as a meadow or a recently cleared woodlot. And you have to look at what the indicators are about what's going on in that soil that would support vegetables. So if it's all grass and sod, and there's some broadleaf out there, and things are kind of weak and tired out, usually it's like people around our neck of the woods will buy an old rundown hay farm or an abandoned farm, and they'll step in and they'll use a plow or till up a piece of ground, and then they'll plant. And sometimes they get lucky, and the soil has been fairly well fortified in the past, and it's maybe rested from the conquering of conventional agriculture or overhang or over potato growing or something. And the garden turns out to be pretty good. And then they can get away with that maybe 2 or 3 years, and then things start to show up, and we often call them weeds. And weeds are simply messengers. They are there for a purpose much greater than our own. They are there to balance, heal the soil, heal the environment. And as humans are tending to do, we disturb soil a lot. And in order to grow our crops, we usually completely conquer a landscape. And then we find ourselves frustrated by weeds, which come ever increasing amounts to try to repair what we have done, because we didn't understand what a disturbed soil wants to do. It wants to heal itself. So many of those plants that we call weeds are the ancestors of our food crops. And some of them actually have 2 or 3-fold the nutrition of our food crops. But it's usually our livestock, if we have any, that enjoy them, and we simply view them as weeds because we don't see them as something we can cash in the marketplace. But a landscape, if you will, say you open the pages of the book by J. McCammon, Weeds, When Weeds Talk. I think the most recent version is When Weeds Talk. It's brilliant. This was like an agronomist who walked out there and said, I'm going to test the soil around every group of weed species that I can find in America and find out what it is their comfort zone is. And he wrote the book according to how a plant experiences life. And that's really great. It is weeds that he's talking about, because weeds is the most expensive challenge in agriculture today. And we need to have a completely different view of that. So when you walk into a field, what is growing there before you disturb the soil is a soil test. It's a wide open thing. It's like the elephant in the kitchen. It's right in plain view, but we just don't have the language. So that author did us all a service, provided us a little bit more of a language. And then after we disturb soil, plow and till, a different set of plants comes in to heal itself. And those plants are the reactionary plants. And those are the ones that we call the ones we would interfere. We try to kill them out. Conventional agriculture is so addicted to herbicides without considering the underlying cause of that plant being there. And then there's another step. When you start planting gardens and plants in a soil that is relatively unknown to you, you need to have your eyes open for symptoms and conditions. That's not tests. The soil tests will not tell you that much about that. But the plant will tell you, if you recognize it, what it looks like in the leaf, what it tastes like. And so going forth, you can access a lot of that information visually with your own crops after you have planted things and say, well, you know, my greens aren't doing well. I've got spinach and chard over here, which is in the Chenopodium group, and they taste terrible. They put hair on my teeth. There's so much oxalic acid that it's can't be stomached. And the first thing that means is you don't have functional calcium as the primary element that plant is living on. Instead, you might have things like potassium and iron and things like that. And so each plant group and each plant symptom set is a really accurate way. And it takes a little while to learn it, but we'll provide some of that going forward in the near future. I used to do a lot more of that, so that a gardener can go out and say, well, you know, the place is riddled with pigweed and lamb's quarters. And I said, well, that's not so bad. But what about things like nettles and chickweed and thistles and grasses predominant? Then you start digging deeper. So what we're really after there is reading the landscape, using assistant sources of information. You can get photographic pictures of plants with deficiency systems showing on the leaf and in the fruit. That's a really great place to start. Have one of those books as a guide for yourself or with your neighbors, When Weeds Talk, and do some experimenting. And then if you're buying compost or making compost, or you're say buying amendments, soil adjusting amendments, we're not going to call them fertilizers per se, but amendments. That means you're trying to adjust a soil system to favor your crop, get it to look better, taste better, compete better. That recipe that you use is kind of like cooking in the kitchen. And the plants, because they're not like kids saying it tastes great, mom, or oh, it tastes like awful, you know, the plants are going to show, they're going to show their favor or disfavor what you do. And so always be an experimenter. This would also include being very wary, not to just go out to the typical hardware store, or maybe worse, Target, Walmart, whatever, Home Depot, and just willy-nilly buy bags of fertilizers and or amendments or mulches and put them on and expect a miracle to happen. You really need to know what's in them. You really need to know how to work with that sort of stuff. Ideally, you would build your own compost from things very local and understand that compost is like a huge stomach, and you can give it a stomach ache, or you can starve it. You can dehydrate it. Think of it as a living being, and you're going to use that compost of greens and browns and waste materials, and preferably build it in the shade, deep shade of hardwood trees, so that it doesn't dehydrate and it's exposed to a far greater range of microorganisms that can inhabit it. It doesn't need to be turned relentlessly to heat up. It might be better where gardeners have kept it cool, so there was more fungal activity. Fungi in your soil is a lot like the soil internet. That's the intelligence part of the soil that links different plant species amongst each other as a community. And they also provide a relationship for the plant where the plant, it has the fungi, mycorrhizae, whether it's associated directly or indirectly, do the plant's bidding to reach water and elements and break down substances the plants sometimes can't access for themselves. You have to remember that plants can't get up and move and walk away when things get uncomfortable. And as farmers, we often make things really uncomfortable for plants, or we make them into addicts of conventional fertilizers and soluble things that ultimately just equal poor quality food. So while we're talking about that, the addiction of fertilizers applied to landscapes that are somewhat misunderstood, then we need to talk about what else is going on. Whatever's happening in the soil is going to put out a signal, because the soil is potentially a very high living, somewhat sentient organism, very complicated, but much like our human bodies. So if a plant is in distress and it's got a malnutrition problem that we may have created, or we may have simply placed it in an unfavorable position, the insects will be some of the first organisms to understand that the plant's out of whack, and the bees, for example, honeybees, won't come to that plant as a preference for nectar, because they live a very short, high-strung life that depends on very balanced nutrition, and their lifespan is 4 to 6 weeks or so. And then we can broaden that bee topic out to all the other beneficial insects. So along with all the honeybees, which we value economically for pollinating and for honey and honeycomb and propolis, we have all these other insects out there that our crops depend on that we don't value directly. And that is this massive, shall we say, a crowd, almost uncountable in numbers on a relatively healthy acre of land, especially if the crops are diverse. There's edges of woodland and meadows and grasses in your gardens. And we need bees that not only consume nectar, but they also are carnivores, like the beneficial wasps and flies that prey upon all sorts of other insects that usually are attracted to destroying our crops because they would like to eat too. And sometimes the crop consumers really get ahead of us, and we've perhaps interrupted the balance. So creating habitat for all the insects, not just honeybees, is critically important. And many of them have extremely small mouths, and so a really vast collection of wildflowers and herbs, plants, trees of every nature that allow these small hyperactive organisms to fly in, fly out, sometimes completely unseen by us throughout the whole growing season, who are the predators that keep cleaning up the pack. They keep cleaning up the larvae and the other beetles and things like that that often attack our crops. And so habitat on a farm, especially in these times when our more valuable, to us anyway, honeybees are facing extinction events. Much of these extinction events are due to human activities. And we could take a deep dive into bees at some time, but we could cleanly say chemicals in the environment that are man-made and loss of habitat are kind of the primary reasons why our beneficial insect populations have been devastated. We keep a bee yard here on the farm with the help of a beekeeper, and he calls this the hospital. And he might have a pollinating contract, and the bees will go out to another farm that's a monocrop or something like that. And they're paid, but the bees live a short life, and they come back to the hives and they're bad tempered. This is like as if someone's pollinating a commercial blueberry field. And so they come back, and he gives them a couple of generations or a whole year to rebuild their strength, if possible, in a place where we keep a habitat. We intentionally plant very diverse cover crops. We keep an unmowed meadow. In the orchard, we don't cut everything down unless we're just about ready to harvest fruit. We want to have a really large, diverse population. And the honeybees are worked into that, but they're not the sole character that we're interested in. If I had no honeybees, I would still get good pollinating and fairly good insect control because of habitat. If I take away habitat, it's going to cost me a lot more effort to raise these crops. And if you're raising cucurbits, cucumbers, melons, and squash, then you definitely want to have a nectar feeder group. Well, particularly interesting would be some years we've seen farms that'll plant, huge areas of winter squash, summer squash, and they just won't get the fruit to set. And we'll look around and say, well, cucumbers too. No bees, no honeybees. So the nectar feeding bees, particularly the honeybees, and sometimes bumblebees, are critically important to a huge sector of crops like the cucurbits, and sometimes even sweet corn, dry corn, and you have it. So habitat for honeybees. And we would also encourage beekeepers not to sugar the bees. Now, it is a practice to take a lot more honey than the bees are willing to give in a natural setting. They always like to have, just like the rest of us, they're preppers, they're always building up a supply of honeycomb to get through the whole season. And there's usually some left over if the hive stays alive and strong. But beekeepers are making money selling honey, so they often take quite a bit of the honey at the end of this harvesting season. And if that leaves the bees short, then they will replace that honey with sugar water mixed in upside down in a jug with like a bleeder valve. But would you feed your kids sugar all winter long? What kind of nutrition is that really? Not the best. Not the best, because what is in there? Well, it's sucrose, glucose maybe. Some people actually use corn syrup, which is not so great for bees. But there's no trace elements, no micronutrients, no minerals. And so colony collapse is due sometimes to malnutrition. And so I would caution people to think about that. Take less honey and keep the bees happier. Move them around a little bit. Be ready to make new unoccupied homes for when they swarm. So we could go on at great length about beekeeping, but bees are sort of like a microcosm within your ecosystem. Without them, with all those species, things start to go downhill really fast. And so there's a little window, there's a little glimpse. And of course, soils that have been deficient, they don't produce good sugar in the flower, and the bees know it. And livestock is the same way. A farmer might go out and with the direction of the crop advisor from the state or whatever, or sometimes a fertilizer dealer, which I often think is a little bit of a conflict of interest. They'll go ahead and plow up, disc, till, and plant a beautiful crop of clover and oats, because that's what people have been telling them is heaven on earth for, say, a Jersey cow or a herd of cows. And it might be true if that's the only thing that the cows have access to. But when cows are given a chance, they walk right through that beautiful, lush, heavily fertilized hay crop, go right through the wire fence, electric fences, and go find some scrubby weeds to eat, because that's what tastes good to them. And for them, the flavor and the frequency of those weeds and mixed species of crops that we don't call hay are what they have to have. That's their medicine field. I see this all the time, over and over again. And so I know we're straying a little bit off the topic, but if you think about it, the bees might not be able to tell you in a language you're going to hear if things are out of whack. But a barn full of cows gets really noisy and really upset, and they get very sick when farmers do things that are no longer in the benefit of the cow, but the benefit of their concept of feeding animals. In other words, if it's a dairy farm that monocrops a lot of corn, maybe does a grain crop, clover, or commercial hay, they may place in there wood ash instead of limestone. And that would be a problem, because the cows, the limestone, the real limestone provides what the cows are looking for, but the wood ash is not the appropriate thing. Even if it creates an exceptional amount of hay, the cows know the difference. But I would encourage people to think of their farms and their gardens as an entire ecosystem. And here's another thing that gets missed. Your neighbors, your closest neighbors in the times we live in, are going to be your most valuable allies in maintaining your hub, your little ecosystem. So if it's a labor shortage, if it's a tool or equipment shortage, all of those things need to be brought together on the table. Water's another big deal. We provide water for several households with one well. Hopefully that'll be something that becomes solar, so we're not dependent on the power company to produce fresh, clean water. And I would say that communities need to act a lot more like they did in the 20s, 30s, and then even previous to the 1900s. They were interreliant in a very small region. So that human agricultural ecosystem was food sovereignty. Yeah, a good example of food sovereignty in action is if you open up your refrigerator and do like a fearless moral inventory of everything that you're buying and purchasing, you can pretty much boil it down to there's not that much in your refrigerator that came from nearby. And you may be forced to change that in the near future. And in the pantry, you might have bread, you might have beans, you might have all these things. These are the dry commodity goods. And not that many people, even though they grow gardens, go into the world of dry commodity goods. Grains sort of is in that territory. So long ago, we jumped into the grain thing and realized this is a very steep learning curve. And it's very hard in the Western world to find tools and grain equipment because of all the extra steps required. For example, compared to, say, a wet root crop like potatoes, with grains, anybody can plant them. How many people have the tools and equipment to harvest it? That's the first thing that stops people. And then it needs to be cleaned and dried and cleaned again, usually twice. And then it has to be stored in a hermetic condition so that insects and molds, beetles, they can't get into that. And then there's the milling part. But these are things that everybody eats. And these are things that need to be part of a food sovereign community. And so we've worked quite a long time with people in other countries and domestically to access or create small scale grain equipment and hubs so that we can round out that local food system and start covering the bases. We even have seen where people have pulled it together to have oil presses. And it is always important to consider that we're not just talking about vegetarian eating or vegan eating, but also people who like a full diet and like to work with livestock. I always remember Joel Salatin telling us, he said, if you're going to raise livestock, make their lives a real pleasure for them. And every day should be a good day except the last. And I often think that should apply to plants as well. And so these are just things to bear in mind. I think to put this down to a narrow framework, do learn to raise bees or cooperate with people who do. Do learn to raise livestock cooperatively so that you are not trapped to be a herdsman or herdswoman, if possible. That's where the community sovereignty comes into place. If you need to process dairy products and meats and grains, figure out all the infrastructure required and try to set it up in a small and efficient hands-on way, and count on your neighbors who are going to be consuming this stuff as part of your labor pool. If there is infrastructure, which is always infrastructure problems, try to solve the infrastructure problems as locally as possible. So with farms that have their minds to all of this, they wouldn't be caught dead without a generator, for example. They often are now installing alternative ways to do their field work. The really smart ones are no longer using tillage and herbicide, by the way. They're learning to plant crops, one crop right in on top of another as a constantly rotating wave, which is kind of like how nature does things. One plant will start to go to seed. Another set of plants that was seeded by nature months before takes advantage of the senescence of the first crop I mentioned, and you have a wave, a constantly regenerating wave. And that's like going out into a hayfield and seeing what organisms and plants are present every week of the year and how they slowly wave in sequence. And we're learning to grow grains like that now. We actually have perennial wheat, which we've never had before, to my knowledge, on this planet up until recently. Now people are working on perennial rice. And a perennial landscape is wonderful because it's not so mechanized. Imagine planting, you plant an orchard once in maybe 35, 40, 50 years. You lose some trees along the way. You plant with something else in the space in between, or you co-plant, even better yet. So mix up your vegetables, row crops, grains, legumes, forage for animals, and tree fruits in a much more wild edge type pattern so that you can benefit from all the things that nature does to help protect its own interests. On the last note, I would say, do look up sririce.org. There's several websites, and it'll let you give you an entire glimpse into a different universe of fewer plants, more space, more diversity, less outside fertilizer, less water, has created record yields for the poorest of people. And that same system of rice intensification we brought home and have used it on all of the crops on our home farm to great success. So that I want to leave that with you at that point, and we'll work it with that. Thank you for listening.